It's always a pleasure to talk about Tunisia and foreign fighters, the two things that I seem to know best. The reason I got the foreign fighter job was because of Tunisia's experience having so many foreign fighters. One of the few good things that came out of the foreign fighter phenomenon. As the ambassador in Tunis, one of the questions that I got most often was, why are there so many foreign fighters from Tunisia? And when I was ambassador from 2012 to 2015, there wasn't really a very good answer to that question. Fortunately, we now have Aaron's report, which I think is one of the best I've seen, that explains the phenomenon and gets at this question of why there were so many foreign fighters from Tunisia. Per capita, I think Tunisia had the most of any source country. It's an important question because it highlights Tunisia's unique situation as a country dealing with terrorism and radicalization in the middle of a democratic transition. Many other countries dealt with the same problems, but they were not in the same sort of transition that Tunisia was in. Coming back to Aaron's study, I want to emphasize 2 points that he made, but I think two points that he got exactly right. First of all, the report makes clear that there are many reasons for the phenomenon. There's no single explanation for why there were so many foreign fighters from Tunisia. I'm not going to get into all the reasons, but Aaron talked about a number of the reasons, some of them political, some of them personal, some of it just due to economic conditions, some of it the appeal of the caliphate. I think the report emphasizing the many reasons for the phenomenon reflects the complex reality much more than some of the more simplistic explanations that we've seen elsewhere. And second, I think the report got the number just about right, 2,900 foreign fighters. That's lower than many other estimates, which I've seen that have gone up to 6,000 or more. The 2,900 number tracks quite well with the numbers that the Tunisian government are using now, and also the internal numbers of the U.S. government. So I think it's still quite a large number, particularly given the size of Tunisia, but it puts the problem in its proper perspective rather than as this huge phenomenon that it was not in reality. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk mostly about the political developments in Tunisia after the revolution that triggered the radicalization, which manifested itself not only in the foreign fighters, but also in the radicalization and the attacks inside of Tunisia. And after I go through that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation and come back to the problems that are posed by the returning foreign fighters now. So first, a brief review of the history. In the aftermath of the revolution in 2011, there were, I think, three factors that set the stage for what happened afterwards. First was the amnesty for all political prisoners in 2011, which freed many dangerous jihadists. There was some debate at the time as to whether they should be included or not, and the feeling, which was pretty widespread in Tunisian society, was that if it was an amnesty, it had to include everybody who had been arrested by the previous regime for political reasons. So the consequences of that became evident later, but at the time it was thought that they had to be included in a general amnesty. Second was the shake-up within the security forces after the departure of President Ben Ali. This diminished the impact of this diminished the capacity of the security forces and helped contribute to some of the problems we saw afterwards. And third, I would point to what I would call the initial tolerance of the activities of the jihadists by the elected troika government, which Aaron alluded to. This was in the period of 2012 to 2013. At the time, the leadership of Ennahda talked about dialogue with jihadists, not so much because they agreed with them in terms of their philosophy or their approach, but the feeling that they had to be brought into the system rather than be excluded from the system. That turned out to be a grave error that Ennahda realized later, but at the time it was widely held within the movement. So these three factors contributed, I think, to what I guess we could call a perfect storm, which allowed the jihadist groups to form in Tunisia, to recruit new members, to facilitate the travel of foreign fighters both to Libya and to Syria and Iraq, and eventually to organize attacks inside Tunisia. Turning to the response of the Tunisian government, I would go through 4 phases in tracking that. And I'd also note that since 2011, there have been 7 different prime ministers in Israel, in Tunisia, and even more governments. So it's not one single government. There were many different governments of different flavors in Tunisia. Of the 4 phases, I'd say the first was from the revolution in 2011 until about September of 2012. And it's a period that I would sort of characterize as a period of denial. After the initial amnesty, radical groups, especially Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia, were allowed to form and to organize openly. The government of Tunisia generally looked the other way, and fighters were allowed to leave for Syria for what was then viewed as a popular struggle against Bashar al-Assad. The security apparatus at the time was distracted by these internal fights and internal divisions after the departure of Ben Ali. The jihadists took advantage of the situation to strengthen themselves. And in this period, there was an initial outflow of foreign fighters, not as great as in the later period, but there was a flow out at this time. The jihadists also did not launch attacks inside Tunisia at this time, at least through the summer of 2012. The second phase, which I would date from about September 2012 to 2014, was one in which the Tunisian government realized that it had a problem and first began to grapple with it. The radical groups, particularly Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia, began to carry out operations within Tunisia itself, beginning with the attack on the U.S. Embassy in September 2012, around the same time as the attack on Benghazi. This was followed by 2 political assassinations carried out by jihadists in 2013. The Tunisian government began slowly to crack down. The first steps included the designation of Ansar Sharia Tunisia as a terrorist group by the Troika government in August 2013, Aaron pointed out. The subsequent government, technocratic government led by Prime Minister Mehdi Joma, began much closer cooperation with the United States and other foreign partners in 2014. With this came the beginning of an improvement of the capacity of the security forces to deal with terrorism and radicalization. This period in which there was a crackdown within Tunisia ironically led to an increased flow of foreign fighters to Libya and Syria and Iraq. With the groups under pressure inside Tunisia, it was easier for their members to leave. And this also coincided with the rise of Islamic State. So there was both a pull from the region as well as a push from the underlying forces that were pushing people to go to fight. The third phase, roughly 2015 to 2016, was one of an active response and a more effective response by the Tunisian government. With the newly elected government in place after 2014, the jihadists launched deadly attacks on civilian targets inside Tunisia, notably the attack on the Bardo Museum and the Hotel in Sousse, frequented by European tourists. This led the government of Tunisia to begin a much more active and ultimately more effective response. They passed a new counterterrorism law in July 2015. And with this greater improvement in security capacity, there was also more success in reducing the foreign fighter flow, aided by improved international cooperation and restrictions by transit countries. And finally, the fourth phase, which ran from about 2017 to the present, is one in which the focus shifted more to returnees. As I said, the flow of foreign fighters going out was way down. The government and the security forces turned their attention to the problem of returnees, of which I think Aaron used the number of 970, which again I think is a number that reflects the reality and also is a number that's approximates what you hear from the Tunisian and the U.S. government when they talk about this. There's been a public debate in Tunisia about what to do about returnees. There's been also a realization of a need for a broader approach, not just a security-based approach, but there's only been limited success in bringing this about. And let me now turn again to this current situation and the focus on the returning fighters. Currently, I'd say security is much improved, certainly compared to 2012 or 2015. The security forces have been largely successful in preventing attacks since December 2015. The one exception being the recent suicide attack in Tunis, although this left dead only the attacker. The attacker wasn't successful in killing any other victims. There's at the present no significant outflow of foreign fighters. However, little has been done to address the underlying motivations for the radicalization. And as Aaron pointed out, radical cells could resume their activity and destabilize the country again if given the opportunity. Generally speaking, in terms of the 970 that have returned, the Tunisian government knows who they are and has been able to identify them when they return through official border crossings. Some of them still continue to smuggle their way back through Libya, and they're harder to track down, but for the most part, when they come through border crossings, the Tunisian government is able to identify them. However, the government has no comprehensive plan on what to do with them once they are identified. In most cases, returnees are interviewed by the security forces at the time of entry, and prosecutors decide whether or not to prosecute. The 2015 anti-terrorism law makes it a crime to travel outside Tunisia to support a terrorist group. However, prosecutors often have found it difficult to develop evidence to successfully make a case against individuals. So while some high-profile cases have been prosecuted and people sent to jail, many others are not. This is a fundamental weakness of the system, and it demonstrates the need for more capacity building in the judicial sector to deal not just with this problem, but the problems more broadly in the sector. For those who are not prosecuted, they're released. In principle, they are monitored by the security forces. However, in Tunisia, as in elsewhere in other source countries, the security forces don't have the resources to fully monitor all of the returnees. Europeans have the same problem, although the numbers are not as great relative to the size of the country as it is in Tunisia. So this is another weakness of the system currently. Also, there's no nationwide program for reintegration, either of returnees from abroad or for radicals who were released from prison after serving sentences for domestic attacks. This is perhaps the greatest weakness of the system. While the local authorities sometimes deal with radicalized individuals on an ad hoc basis, they have very limited means at their disposal, and they have no specialized training to deal with these individual cases. There are some cases where the security forces take a particular interest in the individuals. This has been the case with some of the Tunisians returned from Guantanamo. And in those cases, the security forces do keep track of them, but generally this is the exception rather than the rule. There are models of reintegration that exist in Europe, in Morocco, and Saudi Arabia, but for a variety of reasons, Tunisia has lagged behind in this, and they really still do not have a comprehensive plan to deal with this problem of returnees. Finally, again, as Aaron pointed out, prisons in Tunisia are overcrowded and a breeding ground for both recruitment and radicalization. Tunisia is receiving assistance from the U.S. now in prison management, but Tunisia still has to devote more attention and resources to this problem to address the overcrowding and to prevent radicalization from being bred within the prison system. Up until now, Tunisia has addressed these problems primarily through security means and through the security forces. That probably made sense initially, but I think we're at the point now where Tunisia needs to look more broadly at other areas, at social programs to support de-radicalization and reintegration, at capacity building in the judicial sector, prison reforms, and other steps to address some of the underlying causes of the radicalization. Finally, I'd note that these issues these security issues are intertwined with political and economic issues in Tunisia. As I told Tunisian friends when I was ambassador, Tunisia, to succeed in its democratic transition, has to make progress not only on security, but also on the economy and on the political front. I described it as a three-legged stool, where each of the pillars has to be strong, and Tunisia has to make progress on all three at the same time in order to succeed in the transition to democracy. The economy is under great pressure right now. The state budget has limited resources available for dealing with problems like returning foreign fighters. This is an ongoing challenge. It's one that will be highlighted in the coming year when there will be legislative and presidential elections in Tunisia. And this will be an issue that will certainly be part of the discussion then. I think with that, I'll stop. Happy to take your questions. And once again, it's a pleasure to be here and to be on the panel. Thanks.